Welcome to ILTV's Insider. I'm Aaron Porras, and today, a dangerous wave is feared coming towards Israeli shores. The International Criminal Court at The Hague now determining that it has the jurisdiction to investigate Israel for alleged war crimes, and despite Israel not being a signatory to the ICC. Still, the decision has opened Jerusalem, the IDF, and many Israeli settlements to the possibility of new and tougher scrutiny. Israeli authorities, for their part, blasting the ICC for its continued disproportionate focus on our state.
When the ICC investigates Israel for fake war crimes, this is pure anti-Semitism. The court established to prevent atrocities like the Nazi Holocaust against the Jewish people is now targeting the one state of the Jewish people. First, it outrageously claims that when Jews live in our homeland, this is a war crime. Second, it claims that when democratic Israel defends itself against terrorists who murder our children, rocket our cities, we're committing another war crime. Yet the ICC refuses to investigate brutal dictatorships like Iran and Syria, who commit horrific atrocities almost daily. As Prime Minister of Israel, I assure you, we will fight this perversion of justice with all our might.
Well, joining us to discuss is international relations expert Emmanuel Novonne and Gershon Baskin, author and award-winning columnist for J-Post and Quds newspaper. Thank you both so much for being with us. Now, Dr. Navon, I'll start with you. What's your initial reaction to the ICC prosecutor Fatou Bensouda's decision that is now being backed up with a 2-1 judge's ruling?
Well, this decision goes against the very status of the ICC. First of all, there's no state of Palestine. And then, of course, Israel is not a signatory to the Rome Treaty. So the ICC, first of all, does not have any jurisdiction to look into previous conflicts between Israel and Hamas. That's with regard to legality. And then, of course, on the moral side, putting on the same footing Israel and Hamas is, in my opinion, completely unacceptable. I mean, we know that the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians is still unresolved. But the different wars that have been caused by Hamas launching missiles at Israeli civilians, that is a war crime. And the IDF has already investigated cases in which there were possibilities of collateral damages in the Gaza Strip. Israel is a democratic country where the rule of law applies. And therefore, there is no need for the ICC to get involved. And as I said, putting on the same footing the state of Israel and Hamas is unacceptable.
Galil Shambaskin, your thoughts?
Well, there's a very complex issue. There's an irony to the whole decision, because the irony of it is that in recognizing the jurisdiction of the state of Palestine over the territories that Israel occupied in 1967, the International Criminal Court has actually put life into the dormant two-state solution, which is the irony of the whole thing, because as Emmanuel said, Israel does not recognize the existence of a state of Palestine, but the United Nations does. And in 2012, the United Nations General Assembly voted in a huge majority to grant observer status to the state of Palestine, not to the PLO, but to the state of Palestine. And the ICC has designated that the borders until negotiated of the state of Palestine are the territories that Israel occupied in 1967. I have no doubt that the state of Israel will avoid being brought to the ICC for war crimes committed by the IDF. The IDF does investigate cases, as Emmanuel said, of collateral damage. If it was a state other than the state of Israel, I imagine we would be brought to the ICC for those cases. But I'm sure that with all the legal expertise that Israel has, we won't find soldiers being brought to the court. They may be indicted, they may be arrested when they travel around the world, but I don't think that will ever bring us to anything. On the other hand, the issue of Israeli settlements is entirely different, because according to international law, the Fourth Geneva Conventions, and what the United Nations believes, the transference of civilians from the occupier to the occupied territories is a breach of international law and is designated as a war crime under the Fourth Geneva Conventions. And here Israel has no answer that it can give to the ICC that would justify or legalize. The High Court of Israel may legalize settlements, but it legalizes it on the basis of Israeli law, not on the basis of international law. And here is where I think Israel is going to get into trouble.
Dr. Navon?
No, I disagree with what you just said, because the Fourth Geneva Convention was passed in 1949 after the Second World War, as a result of the occupations and transfer of population by Germany in Eastern Europe. The Fourth Geneva Convention makes it illegal for an occupying power to forcibly transfer its own population to foreign territory, which obviously is not the case of the West Bank. First of all, it was conquered in a war of self-defense, and it was not a sovereign territory before 1967. It was never recognized by the international community as a sovereign territory, because
That's true,
the international community, with the exception of Great Britain and Pakistan, had never recognized the annexation of the West Bank by Jordan, and therefore it does not apply as an occupied territory in terms of international law. And then, of course, the British population, the Israeli population that lives there, is not being forcibly transferred by the Israeli government, but moves there willingly, and therefore the Fourth Geneva Convention does not, in fact, apply to Israeli settlements. The ruling of the Israel High Court of Justice is that Israeli law does apply the Geneva Convention in practical matters, but it doesn't mean that Israel considers this territory as legally occupied, and that is the opinion of many experts in international law, not all of them, but many of them. And therefore, Israel, in fact, does have a very strong case to argue against the ICC and other courts that settlements are illegal. They're not.
I just wanted to point out that what Emmanuel Novonne is saying is actually very much wishful thinking on the part of Israel. The overwhelming majority of international law opinions is that the West Bank is occupied territory. This is the overwhelming opinion of international legal experts, not the Israeli High Court. Although, as you said correctly, the Israeli High Court does apply Geneva Convention standards in recognizing that the legal sovereign in the occupied territories in the West Bank is the commander of the IDF forces there, not the government of Israel. That is, in fact, an application of international law. The fact that the annexation by Jordan was illegal doesn't change the understanding that the territory, and the fact that Israel fought a defensive war. There's no doubt about it. We were attacked by Jordan, and Israel fought a defensive war in the West Bank. Nonetheless, the designation by international law is that those are territories which were belligerently occupied. It doesn't matter.
Let me ask you, Gershon, why in your opinion,
international law relates to that differently than the High Court of Israel? And here, with regard to the ICC, what's important is international law, not Israeli law.
Let me ask you, Gershon, what was illegal in Jordan's annexation of that territory of 1950?
Those territories were designated by a United Nations General Assembly resolution to be divided between the Jewish people and the Palestinian people in a two-state solution on November 29, 1947. And until the territories...
Hold on, Gershon, I have to interject here because those resolutions were rejected 100% by everyone but the Israelis.
Notwithstanding, that is the international legal position.
But how can you fall back? But how can you fall back that far? Because that's not the latest.
That's what international law does. Listen,
that is not international law. Let me.
There have been several amendments and laws passed since then that supersede that.
That's right. So here's the irony of the situation. The irony of the situation is that the only body in the world that can give legality to the Israeli settlements is the Palestinian Liberation Organization in negotiations with Israel. If Israel and the Palestinians agree to divide the territory or to do territorial swaps or to accommodate the settlements, that would legalize the settlements. By international law, the settlements are illegal. Shaking the head and wishing them away or quoting Israeli court decisions doesn't change what international law says.
But repeating the expression international law does not turn decisions that are not binding in international law as binding. The General Assembly resolutions resolutions by the General Assembly are not binding in international law. They are recommendations. And therefore, the resolution passed by the General Assembly on the 29th of November 1947 was only a recommendation. It did not establish any legal sovereignty anywhere else. Now, the territory that was designated by the General Assembly for an Arab state, and by the way, it said an Arab state, it didn't say a Palestinian state.
It was a Palestinian state.
Part of it was conquered by Israel, and part of it was conquered by Jordan. Now, the territory that was conquered by Israel was recognized as legally conquered by the Rhodes Agreement in 1949. Was it illegal also? So if the Jordanian control of the territory designated by the General Assembly for an Arab state was illegal, then so is Israel's control of the Galilee, which obviously I'm sure you're not saying.
Wrong, because it wasn't the Rhodes Agreement that gave sovereignty to Israel over those territories. The Rhodes Agreement was an armistice agreement. It wasn't a peace accord, and it didn't change international law. What did was the authorization of the Oslo Accords by the Security Council and the General Assembly, which granted Israel and the Palestinians the right to negotiate formal borders between
them. Are you saying that before? Are you saying that before the Oslo agreements?
Please. While Israel was granted around 51% of the territory between the river and the sea in the 1947 recognition, the entire world is looking at Israel as being sovereign over 78% of the territory. But the remaining 22% that Israel occupied in 1967 is not Israel. It's recognized as being...
What is the legal source? What, according to you, is the legal source of Israel's right, of its sovereignty over the Galilee and the Negev desert that was designated for an Arab state according to the UN General Assembly in 1948? What is the source of the legality of Israel's sovereignty over those territories?
There are two things I would say. One is that the bulk of international relations, of bilateral and multilateral agreements between the State of Israel and most of the countries of the world has recognized Israeli sovereignty within the 1967 borders. And the second thing was the authorization of the Oslo Accords by the Security Council to allow the Israelis and the Palestinians to negotiate the permanent status of those territories.
But again, the Oslo agreements is not the source of the legality of Israel controlling territory which it conquered in 1948. And the fact that many countries de facto recognize Israel's sovereignty over this territory. So according to what you're saying is that if tomorrow a majority of countries would recognize Israel's sovereignty over parts of the West Bank, that would make it legal?
Yes, it would, because that's how international law works.
Okay, well, so I want to. According to you,
so at this time, I want to just bring things back because I think that we're talking now about the legality of Israel and the Palestinian state and borders, and that's not exactly where I wanted to go. While that is a very valid topic, I want to bring things back to the ICC and specifically about the possibility of an investigation of war crimes. We've talked now a little bit about the settlement issue. Let's talk now about the 2014 Gaza War, for which the Palestinian Authority is trying to get some sort of investigation. How close are we to any sort of investigation on that front, Dr. Navon?
Well, again, we have to understand that, when people talk about international law, about the ICC, that in fact the ICC has been hijacked and politicized, including by the PLO, and that anybody who believes that this is about international law is fooling itself and is fooling our viewers. The same way that the United Nations Human Rights Council has nothing to do with human rights. So this is completely disingenuous. I don't think Israel is going to cooperate with this politically motivated decision. And therefore, in practice, I don't think there is going to be any investigation. And of course, if there is going to be any investigation, then it should also be into the war crimes, and first of all, into the war crimes of Hamas itself. And the fact also that the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, encouraged Israel to continue the war against Hamas because the PLO wanted Hamas to be defeated by Israel. And therefore, the PLO itself should be investigated by the ICC for encouraging the continuation of the war against Hamas.
Gershon?
I think that there will be an investigation, both of Hamas and of Israel. The so-called collateral damage of the war in 2014 was about 1,000 Palestinian civilians killed in Gaza by Israel, and those will be investigated. But as I said, I think that Israel, with its legal know-how and the fact that it has mechanisms to investigate itself, will enable itself to postpone or to completely avoid any trials being brought to the ICC against Israel. Hamas, on the other hand, has a different story, and Hamas can certainly be charged with war crimes for its bombings of rocketing civilian population inside of Israel, which is in no question a war crime. I think it's important to remember, again, we are facing the consequences of international law, whether we like it or not. The ICC has 123 states that are members of the ICC. The state of Israel, in fact, was a co-author of the Statutes of Rome, which are the legal basis for forming the ICC. Israel did not ratify the Statutes of Rome afterwards, like the United States and the USSR and other parties. And the court wasn't established until, I think, many years later after the end of the Cold War, mainly because the US and the USSR used it or used threats of each other in their proxy wars that they were conducting. I think it would be a big mistake for Israel not to cooperate with the ICC. I think it discloses not the right policy vis-a-vis the international community. Israel should cooperate with the court. It should present evidence. If it didn't commit war crimes, it has the evidence to show that it avoided doing collateral damage. It never attacked civilians intentionally. If civilians were killed, it was because they were hiding rockets placed there by Hamas, or Israel was targeting Hamas fighters, combatants, and that the non-combatants who were killed were not because of Israel's intentions. And I think Israel could make a very good case. But by not cooperating with the court, I think that Israel is basically saying to the world, maybe we didn't do something right. And I don't think we should do that. I think we should cooperate.
Do you believe that, because I'm hearing that you're good points, that Israel should cooperate, especially, as you say, because there are legitimate issues with the allegations of war crimes in the first place, being that Hamas hid behind human shields, launched rockets both from and at civilian population centers. But I guess the question then is, with the ICC's history of this focus on Israel, why should Israel be inspired that that's really going to be the case?
There's been no focus in Israel on the court. Israel's not a member of the court. It was only once the jurisdiction of the state of Palestine was established that the court can investigate what Israel did in the state of Palestine according to the laws of the court. The Human Rights Council is a different story. And it's true that Syria and Iran and Russia and China and many other countries have much higher violations of human rights, disastrous records, but they're not members of the court, and the court can't intervene there. All the cases that have been brought to the court until now were in Africa, and I believe in one or two other small, weak countries. The court has not existed for a long time, and it has not attacked Israel or gone after Israel until now.
Dr. Navon?
Oh, yes. First of all, there are a few inaccuracies in what Gershon said. A majority of countries in the world today are not members of the ICC. There are 74 states. There are 74 states that have ratified the status of the ICC. 11 states have signed but not ratified it, and 109 states have done neither. The only members of the ICC are European countries, Canada, most countries of South America, and about 4 or 5 countries in Africa. The rest of the world is not part of the ICC. It is not an international court. The United States is not part of it either, precisely because of the fear that was confirmed as valid, that the ICC would be used and politicized and hijacked by countries to try and indict American soldiers and officers involved in wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and indeed this has been the case. As regard to what Gershon keeps calling the state of Palestine, again, the fact that a majority of General Assembly members recognize this non-existent state is irrelevant, because decisions of the General Assembly are not binding in international law, and the General Assembly does not have the power or the authority to create countries. By the way, it goes to show that the idea according to which the General Assembly created the State of Israel in November 1947 is wrong. The vote of the General Assembly was only a recommendation, in the same way that the General Assembly did not establish the State of Israel. It did not establish a State of Palestine either. And again, the ICC does not include a majority of world powers, on the contrary, and therefore the United States itself is not part of it and is taking action against it, because also in the case of the United States, the ICC has been hijacked and politicized to try and convict American soldiers and officers who've been fighting on behalf of the United States in places such as Afghanistan and Iraq.
Okay, so I think that the discussion is moot, and we should just ignore the ICC and decisions of the United Nations, the General Assembly, or other international decisions. Why should we even pay attention to any of them? We are
definitely when it comes to I think that definitely when it comes to bodies. When it comes to bodies where you have a majority of dictatorships and countries that have no respect for the rule of law, why pay attention to it? Why the General Assembly?
You just said that a majority of the countries of the members of the ICC are in Europe. These are our allies and our friends.
Because they're not the ones sending the soldiers. They're not the ones sending the soldiers. They get a free ride, and they're not sending the soldiers, most of them, to dangerous places around the world, and therefore they don't take any risk.
Europe had soldiers in Afghanistan. Many of them had soldiers in Iraq.
Yeah, but very few. But in other words...
And the United States did commit war crimes in Iraq. And those crimes were tried even within American courts by cases of American soldiers committing war crimes. When you have wars, you generally have war crimes. And Israel has committed war crimes in Gaza and in other places in the occupied territories against the Palestinians. And we can walk around the world like this and make believe that none of that exists.
Well, now, Gershon, we spoke earlier about Israeli investigations into a lot of these allegations. Do you see validity in those investigations, or do you throw them out because Israel performed?
I think that the bulldozing of the Sajaiya neighborhood in Gaza was a war crime. It was not a specific attack against armed targets, against combatants. It was the removal of an entire neighborhood on the border of Israel and Gaza, and the destruction and the death and demolition that took there, I believe, was a war crime.
So you believe, prove it.
Sorry, well, I think
that Israel should stand up before the court and prove its innocence.
With that, gentlemen, thank you so much. I want to thank you both so much for being with us today, but unfortunately that is all the time that we have. Gershon Baskin, Dr. Emmanuel Novonne, it's been a pleasure to have you. Everybody watching at home, tune in next time on Insider for more in-depth analysis on everything Israel. Also, if there's a topic that you want us to cover next, please let us know about it in the comment sections online. And finally, remember that for more news from Israel, follow ILTV on Facebook, like us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channels. I'm Aaron Porras. Thank you so much for watching.